Now it's my pleasure to introduce this year's distinguished alum in computer science and distinguished speaker, Paul Barford. Paul Barford is a professor in the computer science department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a bachelor in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois and a PhD in computer science from Boston University. His research interests are in internet measurements, data science, and security. He is the founder of 2 successful internet startup companies. He has published over 100 papers in forums like ACM Internet Measurement Conference and ACM SIGCOMM Conference. He is a fellow of the ACM and the IEEE. He has a number of award-winning papers, and his Internet Atlas project was named one of the 100 greatest innovations of 2017 by Popular Science magazine. Lastly, but most importantly, his hobby is taking naps. So he will tell you more about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Paul Barford, this year's distinguished alum in computer science.
Thank you, Ibrahim. As a professor who has attended many commencement ceremonies over the years, I usually view the commencement speech as a price that we all have to pay before we can move on to the other activities and endeavors that we're really looking forward to. So I'll endeavor to be brief to the extent that a professor can ever be brief when presented with a microphone. Congratulations to the 2019 Boston University Computer Science graduating class. To parents and relatives and friends of the graduates, congratulations to you, and thank you for the support that you've given to make this day possible. It's a great accomplishment for all. When Abraham invited me to give the commencement speech, my first response, which he can verify, was, "Are you sure that you have the right alum?" After he confirmed that I was indeed the right alum, I thought I would try to be thoughtful and dignified in my next response. So I waited for a solid 3 seconds before accepting. And after that, I thought long and hard about commencement speeches that I've enjoyed over the years, from accomplished individuals like David Foster Wallace or Barack Obama. And I quickly came to the conclusion that I was unlikely to give a speech anywhere near as entertaining or as insightful. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to stick with what I know, which is professing about computer science, and hopefully dropping a few hints here and there about good things like Foster Wallace's "This is Water" speech, which you should definitely listen to if you get a chance. Let me begin by expressing my heartfelt thanks to the Boston University Computer Science Department for the recognition of distinguished alumnus. I'm truly humbled and honored by the recognition. It's rare that one gets an opportunity to express gratitude in a public forum, but I'm going to take a few minutes to do so. I remember very clearly what brought me to BU. After completing my undergraduate degree, I'd worked as an electrical engineer in the greater Boston area for about 8 years and decided it was time to make a change. So I reached out to professors at a number of local universities to inquire about the possibilities. So my first meeting was with a professor at a university across the river that I won't name, Harvard. And we got on pretty well in the meeting for about the first 5 minutes. And then he asked me how old I was, which I thought was kind of an odd question. I responded that I was 31. And he said, "Well, we don't need to continue," which really surprised me. And I asked why not. And he responded, "Well, all great science is done before the age of 30. And I had no hope of being a successful researcher." And that was it for the meeting. Washed up at age 31. It really happened. So the next meeting was with a new professor at Boston University who had recently begun studying something really interesting called the World Wide Web. It was new back then. We met at his office, and then we walked over to the Marsh Chapel Common area to talk about the computer science program. And my memory of the next 2 hours is pretty clear. Number one, this was a fellow who I really wanted to work with. And the second is that I ate 2 large sandwiches over the course of 2 hours, which was a little bit embarrassing, but I was doing a lot of running at the time, so I needed to keep my fuel tank topped up. I recall my first day of class, or first couple of classes at BU. I took Professor Kafori's programming languages class, And I'll never forget the first night of homework sitting at my kitchen table in the house that I owned, because of course I'd been out in industry for a while, thinking this homework is all a bit childish, isn't it? But nevertheless, I made it through, and later in the semester bumped into Professor Kafori in the hallway and asked if he had some advice before the final. And he thought for a second, and he passed on the following: don't cram. Don't cram. Good words that I've passed on to my own students many times over the years. Over the course of the next 5 years, I took classes and interacted with many great people in the BU Computer Science Department. Professor Snyder, Professor Homer, Professor Levin, Professor Gotch, Professor Sklarov, Professor Mata, Professor Kolios, Ellen Grady, and all of my fellow students. To all of you, thank you for preparing me to be a computer scientist. To the three professors who were my research advisors, Professor Bastavros, who taught me the process of research, Professor Byers, who taught me the art of research, and especially to Professor Cravella, my mentor and collaborator and friend, who taught me the joy of research. To all of you, a heartfelt thank you. I feel extremely fortunate to be a computer scientist, not just because it means guaranteed employment, right, parents? But because it means I can work on pretty much any problem and be assured that it's a computer science problem. We'll come back to that. But computer science wasn't always this way. Indeed, for much of its history, it wasn't even called computer science. It was all about math and logic. And then there's the old question, can something actually be a science if it has the word science in the name? That's something to think about as you have lunch today. So what does it mean to be a computer scientist? I always feel like the best place to start answering hard questions like that is with a bit of historical context. The notion of computing and computation actually has a long history. And what I'll call the first era of computing, or Precambrian computing, starts with advancements in math and logic, and then the development of machines for computation that start with the abacus and similar simple devices. The first example of a complex computing machine was Charles Babbage's difference engine. Has anyone ever heard of that, the difference engine? Maybe not too many. It was the world's first mechanical computer, designed in the mid-19th century. Babbage was a genius who ultimately failed to build the difference engine. However, the design is recognized today as having key elements of modern computers. So if anyone ever asks you who invented the first computer, Babbage is a good answer. The second era of computing, or Jurassic computing, begins in the 20th century. This is the era of general-purpose computing and was focused largely on hardware and algorithms. You've probably heard the story of Alan Turing's efforts to build a machine called the bomb, which was central to decryption of German codes in World War II, and this was the subject of the movie The Imitation Game several years ago. However, Turing's fundamental contribution to computer science was his 1936 paper on computable numbers with application to the Entscheidungsproblem. It's a good German word, Entscheidungsproblem. I had to practice it before I came up here. As computer scientists, you should all read that paper. It's what started things. It describes what Turing now calls, or what we now call the Turing machine, which is the basic model for general purpose computation. The first electronic computer was called Eniac and was developed at the University of Pennsylvania in 1946. This sparked development of many such mainframe computers over the coming decades. These systems were primarily focused for defense, scientific, and engineering applications, so they were never really available to the general public. The next really big advancement was the development of the microprocessor by Intel in the late 1960s. This enabled miniaturization of much of the hardware in computers. It improved computational capability and lowered costs. It also paved the way for the first personal computer, which was called the Altair 8800, that was produced in 1975. Interestingly, while progress on computer hardware continues, there really haven't been any fundamental changes since the 1970s, although I'm sure my colleagues who work on computer hardware would argue that. Around about the same time that microprocessors were invented, a group of very young people led by a 29-year-old were funded by a US Department of Defense entity called the Advanced Research Projects Agency to develop a radical new communication technology called packet switching. The idea was to create a capability to break a message into separate pieces, to attach an address to each piece, and then to transmit the pieces, with fingers crossed, until they arrive and can be reassembled in their destination. The first test of this ARPANET took place in 1969. And as the story goes, the development team located at UCLA started typing the word login to access a remote computer at UC Santa Barbara. They were on the phone with the Santa Barbara team at the same time, and when they typed the letter L, the UC Santa Barbara team cheered and yelled L. Then they typed the next letter, O, and the UC Santa Barbara team cheered and said O. Then they typed the letter G, and the system crashed, and they all toasted each other as a successful test of the first version of the internet. That's a true story. This is what I call the third era of computing, or early modern computing, where communication plays an equal role with computation. The history of the internet is marked by acceleration and titanic shifts in the socioeconomic fabric of the world. The World Wide Web, Google, social networks, online gaming. Think about the fact that the smartphone is only 12 years old. The fourth era of computing, the modern era of computing, which is where we are today, is the era where, as investor Mark Andreessen says, software is eating the world. If you haven't read Andreessen's 2011 essay on the topic, you should. It's really insightful. In short, pretty much everything is becoming a computer science problem. When you think of the transformations that have taken place since the time that I was at BU some years ago, in music, iTunes, in taxi services, Uber and Lyft, and TV, Hulu, and hotels, Airbnb, and telephones, and even simple things like maps, it really boggles the mind. So while this is mostly great for you and me, it's led to a society that's filled with new and scary challenges. Cyber Cold War. Old industries are transformed in a matter of years, and it seems like only the technically savvy are viable. Is this fair? Is this a society that we want? I'm not sure, but I don't think so. And what's on the horizon? What's the next era of computing? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or something that one of you, I'm sure, will invent. So how do we consider these issues, especially when so many issues have now become computer science issues? Well, that's an issue I'm grappling with myself. I'm not trained as a philosopher or a sociologist or a historian or an anthropologist. I'm a scientist, so I'll offer a couple of thoughts from that perspective. I believe that computer scientists have three responsibilities. One is to scientific honesty. A second is to personal integrity. And a third is to society. These are things that aren't usually discussed in computer science classes, but I think it's vital that you graduates think about them. By scientific honesty, I mean recognizing that science is fundamentally the pursuit of truth, the activity of the creative and curious mind. But it also recognizes that science is a slow, tedious, and failure-prone process. It requires attention to detail. It requires being skeptical while at the same time being transparent and open to new ideas. The issue of personal integrity is something that is maybe a little more challenging because it's not something that we talk about very much socially. The dictionary definition of integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. That's fine, that's good words. But those kinds of dictionary definitions haven't really helped me too much in my quest for becoming a better scientist and a person over the years. What I've found much more helpful are the stories of people who have lived exemplary lives. One of my favorites is George C. Marshall, who was Eisenhower's boss in World War II and later the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for what is now called his Marshall Plan. He's a fascinating historical figure, and one of the reasons that you may not have heard of him is that that's how he wanted it. He never sought the limelight. But he was always recognized by people around him as the best and brightest. Anyway, Marshall was once asked how he picked people for command, and his response was, the most important factor of all is character, which involves integrity, unselfishness, and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to self-sacrifice in the interest of the common good. Character is another one of those ideas that you may hear, but you probably don't think about very much. At least I didn't for a long time. And now I strive to be a person of character, although some of my BU professors may say that I am a character. It's not the same thing. Finally, there's our responsibility as computer scientists to society. It's not just about writing code or exponential growth or so-called unicorn companies, the things we hear about in the news related to computer science all the time. We are at the center of things now. It's up to us. We are the they that people refer to when they talk about who knows and who will solve the problems. Climate change, global security, economic disparity, these are our problems now. So embrace these challenges as opportunities as you take next steps as computer scientists. I have high confidence in you, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you, and congratulations once again.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's my privilege to recognize you as the 2019 Distinguished Alumnus in Computer Science.